So what is a random encounter? Probably the best question to kick this off with, right? You might have an idea already about what a random encounter is. 2d4 wolves, maybe, some loot, a roll of thunder some way off in the distance. You might have scanned or created random encounter tables to fit your game setting. You might have a decent grasp of when's a good idea to roll for them and how's best to blend them into your sessions. Or you might have tried them out but dismissed them completely in favour of another approach. So here's another question. When was the last time you went back to your reference books and read the basics about random encounters, about what they can actually do for your game sessions? If it's been a while, here's the rub. Your players are talking about doing something for which you've not planned. You need time to think. Run a random encounter. Your players are completionists, checking under every floorboard, talking to every idiot that passes them in the street, retracing their steps in case something was missed. Run a random encounter. At every turn, your players err on the side of caution, trying to avoid picking up so much as a scratch until they reach their goal. Run a random encounter. You're glaring dumbfounded as your players fumble about trying to figure out what to do, where to go, and either you've had enough or you want to give them a nudge. Run a random encounter. Things are getting a bit stale and you just want to shake things up. Run a random encounter. A bit tongue-in-cheek, yeah, but what actually is a random encounter? Bottom line is that it's nothing more than an event within your game session which neither you nor your players have really anticipated. Now, before you go on, let's go over that again and chew it a bit. Bottom line is that it's nothing more than an event within your game session which neither you nor your players have really anticipated. As a dungeon or games master, even if you've done your homework and draw up ahead of the sessions a list of possible random encounters, the idea here is that even you shouldn't know in advance when a random encounter will happen or how it will play out. Why though? In a game where all eyes are on you to lay out what the players will face, why in the nine hells would you want to be unprepared and ambush yourself like that? So here's what bucket loads of dungeon and games masters out there tend to forget. What happens in your tabletop role-playing game shouldn't be on you. I mean, yeah, you sit in what you might think is the big chair. You've read the rules, you've planned the story arcs, thought about what might happen before each session. But the game's not yours. It belongs to you and your players. You all have a role to play. Your role is to present the hooks, the conflicts, to tee up the players, to outline the picture they need to go on and paint, and other such cliches. And then it's over to your players, albeit with your ongoing input, to make a story out of what you present. A story that both you and they will remember forever because you all had a very large hand in how it went down. In short, you need to let go a bit. If you're twisting yourself in knots trying to carve out story arcs that would fit snugly into a Shakespearean tragedy, you need to think a little differently. You ain't writing a book here. You need to think about the game not as something that would look breathtaking on paper, not as a reflection of your writing chops, and rather as a living, breathing creation that matures and refines and evolves and surprises in every single moment you all get together. And yeah, you need to get comfortable with the idea that no matter how much you prep, chaos will always find its way into the fabric of your story and rip its sturdy linear structure the hell to shreds, as it should. How amazing would it be, right, if this intricate story, this tale of highs and lows that you and your players develop over time, is one you could all look back on and think, geez, how the hell did that happen? Why should you, as the dungeon games master, miss out on the surprise? And so, random encounters. They can be slotted perfectly into any type of game. Combat-driven, dungeon delves, narrative-focused, fictionally positioned, and any other game label folks like to throw out there. However you and your players have decided to play, sprinkling into your sessions an element of total randomness can strike at the very heart of the game itself. At its core, this little game you play wants to hold collaborative and improvised storytelling above all else, with dice rolling and the presentation of settings and conflicts a mere tangential mechanic. Chaos keeps every one of you on your toes and separates this game from all others. When it boils down to it, despite what you may have picked up from naysayers, the chaos of random encounters can be a vital tool in your belt. They can add to or interrupt the plots you've planned. They can remind your players that both they and you are at the mercy of chaos. They can reveal to your players that the setting doesn't revolve around their characters, that at any moment something might happen that reminds them to stay aware, that prompts them about what they're meant to be doing, and warns them not to dilly-dally, that forces them to make decisions and think carefully over the potential consequences. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong, if they're not designed well or executed carefully, they can tend to become an unwelcome obstacle or distraction to players trying to zero in on their overarching goals. And to my mind, it's precisely this that's given random encounters a bad reputation in some parts of the multiverse. But here's the thing, if you take some extra care in your design and your execution, and rather than simply throwing at your players those 2d4 wolves without thinking, if you throw a random encounter at your players with just a little more care, you might end up finding that the ripples from that one encounter go on to be felt by your players and by your setting for a very long time to come, in ways no one could have predicted. Not every random encounter needs to be earth-shattering. I get that. But if the aim is, in every session, to entertain, why can't your random encounters be as equally creative and crammed full of hooks and conflicts and twists as the rest of what you have in store? So think about it. Have the random encounters you've been throwing at your players up to this point been as optimised for fun as you'd hoped? So why the hate? Like I say, there are plenty of folks out there who see the use of random encounters as a total scourge in the game. This reputation's festered like a virulent plague down the ages. From what I've picked up, the main reasons they're cast aside by a great many dungeon and games master are that, first, there's no point in the party engaging in story-distracting random encounters when it's not been given a quest to do so, and so won't be rewarded. And second, no one should ever die in a random encounter which falls outside the parameters of the main story. So here's my retort. Isn't everything that happens to the characters a part of the story? I'm sure I heard someone yapping somewhere that it ain't about the destination, that the journey and all the randomness in between is what helps you grow and learn and create all the fun and memories. Wouldn't it be a little weird if everything that happens to the party just coincidentally ties in with the character's story arcs or what the dungeon or games master have plotted out? More crucially, rather than being something the dungeon and games master meticulously plotted out in advance, isn't the story something you tell after the experience is over? And putting aside the fun element, if the random encounters the party engages in ends up gifting it with experience points, loot, information, meat, an understanding of skills and weaknesses and of the setting through which it travels, isn't that something to hold on to? My feeling is that in the main, this bad rep has come about because of two things. One, a fundamental misunderstanding of randomness in the game, and two, a lack of available practical help on how to roll with the chaos. I get it though. The history of the game and how random encounters were introduced, it hasn't helped. It's believed that the concept of random encounters and wandering monsters really sprouted from two games. Chainmail, developed by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin in 1971, and Avalon Hill's Outdoor Survival from 1972. When the original edition of Dungeons & Dragons came out in 1974, an interest began to involve in making dangerous hex-based travel between dungeons and other locations an actual part of the game. The rulebook mentioned right there in black and white that dungeon masters should use equipment, or as equipment, the rules from Outdoor Survival when designing travel encounters. Amongst other things, it was this developing synergy between the two games that helped separate D&D from all the other similar games being played at the time. Mainly because, rather than this being solely a war game where you spent most of the time strategizing how to defeat that other dude, in this game you were dealing with individual characters trying their level best simply to survive in chaotic wilderness and dungeons. And back in what they call the day, therefore, random encounters were the very definition of random. Long rest in the woods, you say? Let's roll this and see what happens. Advancing through hexes off the beaten track, you say? Well, I rolled this, so say hi to my throng of wandering monsters. You had a table, you had monsters on that table, you rolled to see which of those monsters the party would face. Job done. Over the years, however, the way the game was being placed began to change. In D&D and the other tabletop role-playing games that followed, the popularity of random encounters began to wane as the rules developed to reflect a richness entering the game. These days, let's face it, tabletop roleplay games have matured. Players of today tend to want more from their time at the table. They want immersion, they want story arcs, they want entertainment and fun and heartbreak and drama and more. And they want this from the moment they sit at the table until the dice are rolled. Crucially, they want this from the dungeon or games master. Over the years, a menacing expectations broke the dam and saturated the world of tabletop RPGs. An expectation that the dungeon or games master is the one person in charge of the narrative, of the story, of the player's fun. Now, I love online streaming and content as much as the other did, but to my mind, it's this perpetual content that's given strength and weight to the expectation. I've watched over the years as certain dungeon and games masters in popular games, despite, to be fair to them, any objections on their part, have become almost idolised and heralded as the one mainly responsible for the dazzling amazingness of their game. Every week I breathe in screeds of blogs and posts and streams and more that for myriad reasons appear to raise the dungeon or games master on a higher pedestal than the other players. Moving a step back though, looking at the actual people behind all the blogs and posts and the streams, the fundamental organisms of their evolution were modules. Thinking only about D&D, TSR, which was Tactical Studies Rules, the company given birth in 1973 by Gary Gygax and Don Kay, were the first to take adventure scenarios that had been played out in D&D tournaments in the US and publish them as modules. And so we were gifted classics like Temple of the Frog, Wee Warriors, Palace of the Vampire Queen, Keep in the Borderlands, Tomb of Horrors, and Temple of Elemental Evil. Fantastic adventures that I definitely recommend you try out, and which paved the way for the most recent Uber adventure modules like Curse of Strahd, Tomb of Annihilation, Baldur's Gate, Descent into Avernus. It's also happened in other tabletop RPGs, but although the work in these published modules and adventures have been truly magnificent, think about how that's come across over the years to dungeon and games masters. Think about all the writing that's gone into the module. Maps, NPCs, plots, monsters, stat blocks, the whole kit and caboodle, all written down there in black and white with breathtaking artwork and compiled expertly by huge teams of professional games designers. And now think of what that's implied for dungeon and games masters thinking about running their own game. Oh, right. So the players want me to homebrew. They don't want a module this time. So the last module we played had all this stuff in it. I guess I'll need to come up with all the same stuff for my own campaign. If the players ask me about anything, I'll need to have it prepared. Because if I don't have it prepared and the game then sucks, it'll be my fault. And so it's this very same expectation which has led swathes of new and even seasoned dungeon and games masters to freeze in terror at the thought of messing up, to handle the weight of this expectation by planning every last detail of their upcoming sessions and campaigns because they feel it's all on them. And the more they plan, the more intricate stories they write for the players before anyone's even sat down at the table, the more likely it's become for the introduction of chaos and random encounters to completely stress out these dungeon and games masters as they turn cartwheels trying to squeeze everything into what else they had planned. I mean, if something happens that hasn't been written down and prepared, it ain't fair on them, it ain't fair on the players, and it definitely ain't necessary. But right now, it is what it is. As this perceived need for more planning and depth throughout the game has developed over time, the corresponding relevance of random encounters has become lost amongst all that narrative. It's now less about chucking in random encounters to control how quickly players devour the pie, and more about making sure how juicy the pie tastes, making sure the players leave the table satisfied after an amazing meal. You still have random encounter tables popping up here and there. But here's the thing. Although rolling on these tables is a random act, all the legwork and thinking you then might feel pressurised to undertake in order to maintain immersion, to add in all that conflict now typically craved by the players, particularly if that doesn't come naturally to you, can end up giving you a total headache. It takes away from the theory of it being picked from the table and thrown swiftly at the players. And like I say, in the context of all eyes being the dungeon or games master, has definitely contributed to the skeletal frame of random encounters being cast aside in favour of less random story arcs. So this is where the idea of the fleshed out random encounter began. It's an attempt to recognise the current trend of the dungeon games master being perceived as mainly responsible for the story. It's an attempt to redress the balance a little, to help out the dungeon or games master while encouraging the players to step up. The approach to random encounters that I now use came from years and years adding meat to the bones of random encounter tables in the reference books and modules. Although the tables are okay for encounter building, particularly for new dungeon or games masters, and although a lot of the time they've been well designed and suited quite masterfully to the settings for which they've been written, for me, I've just come to find them lacking a fair bit in inspiration. The idea behind the tables is to let you roll up a quick encounter on the fly, so you can throw at the players a bunch of monsters or experiences that fit the setting or module you're playing. Roll a 3, pull out your 2d4 wolves. Roll a 6, here come 1d12 Tarasques, and so on. Does that make an encounter? In my experience, I've found that although the bare minimum information provided in random encounter tables has been designed to inspire, to help the dungeon or games master think, right, how can I use this? Oh, well, I could. In fact, the lack of juice in what the table provides leaves you with a fair bit of work to do in order to pack it full of conflict, to make it engaging and entertaining and fantastically unique. And this work needs to be done quickly if it's all rolled out at the table. I mean, I do recognise that this concern might be just me, and that others do find the tables inspiring and easy to slot in. But I've seen and been engaged in so many discussions with those who've struggled to make random encounters worthwhile, and so have cast them aside for the sake of what they feel is a more structured and manageable game. See, random encounter tables have always been intended to give dungeon and games masters something quick to add flavour to their sessions at the table, something to remind the characters that they're delving in a world that's alive and kicking and dangerous, so much so that at any given moment, if they're not alert, they might blunder into something they least expect. But if the idea is to add an encounter quickly, to me, this has always seemed at odds with the theory that to surprise and delight your players, particularly more seasoned ones, pretty much all the encounters you lay before your players should be laced with conflict and decision points and dramatic questions, should relate thematically to your setting or campaign, and, well, therefore, make some kind of sense to your players and build up the immersion. Don't get me wrong, rolling up 2d4 wolves might be fun, I get that. It's the reason that for each random encounter deck I created, I've also rolled up a bare bones version called the Quickening that locked you in with the pure chaos theory of the game. But what if those wolves aren't simply after their dinner? What if they've been controlled magically to seek out something the party holds dear? What if the party meets those wolves in a terrain that begins to shift between them during the battle? What if other enemies appear as they fight? What if the wolves stand between the party and a friendly NPC who's dangling on the edge of a cliff about to fall off? What if, after defeating the wolves, instead of crashing to the ground, the wolves turn to ash, which reforms into the air, into a terrifying ethereal being? I found that even though rolling on these tables might let me access the actors in the encounter, the monsters or NPCs or loot the party would face, as the DM I've still needed to work out how to make the encounter enticing, packed with flavour, relevant, immersive, and that takes work and time, which, as I say, takes away from the theory of the tables speeding things up. And so, if your players crave from you the fun of intricate layered drama, how fair is it on you as the dungeon and games master to have to pull that off when all you're given behind your screen is 2d4 wolves? So let's boil all this down into a nice stew for you to munch on. The game needs its rules and mechanics. It needs to assign roles to the dungeon or games master and to the players. It needs everyone around the table collaborating to create an experience, the story of which will live on in their memories as they were equally crucial in its development. And to make the game breathe, it also needs chaos. It needs chaos to remind everyone around the table that they're each at its mercy. It needs chaos to separate the experience from reading a book, from watching a movie, from playing a pre-programmed RPG. But here's the thing about chaos. Unless you're some deity sitting on a cloud, or unless you spend most of your days pondering theory in the quantum realm, it might be reassuring for you to accept the simpler premise that something can't come from nothing. And so chaos isn't born in a vacuum. It comes from something. In the game, it comes from each and every interaction in the setting by the players and by the dungeon and games master. It comes from the decisions they make, decisions that change the setting and its inhabitants in complex ways. So for chaos to exist, before all else, there needs to be a setting, and that setting needs to have inhabitants. And that setting needs to live and breathe before, during, and after the players and the dungeon and games master begin to change it with all their decisions. And how can you help everyone feel that setting living and breathe? Enter random encounters. Cook them well, blend them into your setting as randomly as you like, and the taste will delight you and your players for years to come.